But the point is that the US has accused China of trying to control social media and censoring everything. And now we see this mass exodus of people in the US having to use a Chinese platform because the US government censored them. And this is not just a question of censorship, it's also an economic question. There are many people whose businesses and whose jobs revolve around using TikTok, and they've lost that means of income. So there's another significant blow to people in the US. But it's deeply ironic in another way, which is that, the US claimed that supposedly TikTok was being used by China to spy on people. There's no evidence of this. TikTok is not even based in China. Ironically, TikTok has two main bases, which is in Singapore and Los Angeles, California. And TikTok is different from the Chinese version of the app. So for most of these Chinese apps, there is a different version of the app that is international, and then there's a version that is used in mainland China. The domestic app is called Douyin, and that is the Chinese version of TikTok. Unless you're using a VPN inside mainland China, you can't use TikTok. So this idea that China had access to all of this data is simply not true. In fact, there was a thread that went viral this past week that was published by a former engineer at TikTok, published it on Twitter. And in it, he said, I worked at TikTok as an engineer, ask me anything. And he repeatedly said that the data collection policy of TikTok was the same data collection policy of Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, all of these US big tech companies. There was no difference in terms of the data collection policy. So what this really is about, I think, is two main things. It's about preventing any alternatives, any competition to US big tech monopolies. And if you look at, by the way, Trump's inauguration, who was present right in the center sitting with his cabinet members, it was all of the billionaire oligarchs from these big tech companies. Elon Musk, who's basically co-president at this point, he has this very senior role in the Trump administration, the richest man on earth with over $400 billion of wealth. Right next to him, Jeff Bezos, the second richest man on earth, the founder of Amazon with over $200 billion of wealth. And then right next to him, Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook, now Meta, parent company, who also has $200 billion of wealth. So, these are and right next to them as well, you have the CEO of Google and Alphabet. Also, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, was there. He's not present in this video. But the point is that these are the big tech oligarchs that play a very significant role in determining U.S. government policy. They had spent a long time lobbying to ban TikTok, and the U.S. government banned TikTok to prevent any competitors. So these U.S. big tech corporations can continue to dominate. And then there's also the element of censorship. Ironically, the U.S. accuses China of censorship. We now know that one of the reasons that U.S. politicians sought to censor TikTok is because a lot of young people were using TikTok to get access to information. For instance, about the horrific crimes against humanity and genocide being committed by Israel with U.S. weapons and U.S. support, or many other conflicts. TikTok had an algorithm that was not entirely controlled by the U.S. government, unlike Facebook, unlike YouTube, which these are owned by companies, Meta and Google respectively, that have billions of dollars of contracts with the U.S. government, that have a long history of going along with U.S. government censorship requests. Or in the case of Israel, we know that Israel frequently asks Facebook to censor Palestinians, and they censor Palestinians. People who are, artists and journalists. They're not even involved in an armed movement. So there are so many levels of hypocrisy that are breaking down. There's the Biden administration's hypocrisy, the U.S. government overall, its hypocrisy. Trump originally trying to ban TikTok and now claiming to be the savior of TikTok. Every single level is just full of this ridiculous hypocrisy. But I think you said that one of the most interesting points of all of this is that now we see people in the U.S. are finally getting to communicate with people in mainland China, despite the fact that after many decades and decades, they've been bombarded with propaganda telling them all of these lies. Suddenly, they can talk to average people in China and realize that the situation in China is much better than they believed, that many people do live decent lives, and hundreds of millions of people have been lifted out of poverty. And the ridiculous view that people have of China in the U.S., is based on this cartoonish propaganda. In reality, many people in China can afford healthcare, whereas in the US, they can't. Food is much cheaper. The standard of living is even higher, despite the fact that incomes are lower. So there's a lot we could respond to, but that's the kind of my overall summary there.
Yeah, so one thing that I want to point out that's unique about Xiaohongshu, which we showed some of the screenshots, is that it has this text note feature where people can write questions and then other people will respond. So what's been happening as part of this like cross-cultural dialogue on Xiaohongshu is that Chinese people are asking Americans about like what life is like in China. Americans are asking Chinese people, what life is like in China. And, I've been seeing lots of responses to this. Like, Americans are really seeing through the U.S. government's propaganda. And as part of this cross-cultural exchange, they're having this kind of dialogue about, what the U.S. government has been lying to about China, like to the U.S. people.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, when we should keep in mind that when you look at the Western media coverage of China, basically everyone who works at a major media outlet is an anti-China activist. I would not even call them journalists. They are professional anti-China activists, and they use the media to spread disinformation that benefits the U.S. government and other Western governments that try to, demonize China as part of this new Cold War. If you want to move up the ladder in the mainstream corporate media, you have to be anti-China. No one who's seen as pro-China is going to get a job or be promoted. They will face serious consequences. So it's no surprise that people in the West basically know nothing about China. And recently, the Chinese government, I think, has made a very smart move, and they've significantly reduced the obstacles to getting a visa. And now there are people from many countries, especially in Europe, who can come to China visa-free. And now we're seeing on YouTube, for instance, all these people, these travel bloggers coming to China and being blown away. They're like, I've never seen anything like this. I mean, the infrastructure, first of all, is absolutely amazing. There are these cities in China that many people in the West have never even heard of. They have populations that are larger than New York City, and they have infrastructure that is better than any city in the United States. So that itself has been very eye-opening. But then there's also the fact that you have all these people on Xiaohongshu who are talking to people in mainland China and realizing that just because in the US you make more money doesn't mean you have a better standard of living. Because in the US, everything is extremely expensive because the US, the role it plays in the global capitalist system is as the banker of the world. It has these financial assets that capitalists around the world invest in and hold their wealth in, which pushes up the price of everything in the US, especially real estate, because housing is for investment, not for living in the US, unlike in China, where President Xi has emphasized that housing is for living in, not for speculation. In the US, it's the opposite. So the cost of everything is so expensive. In order to survive, you have to get paid higher wages than in other countries. But then what you can actually purchase with those wages is lower than in a place like China. Meanwhile, you see these, Western neoliberal economists, and they say, oh, look at China's nominal GDP per capita. It's so much lower than the U.S., not accounting for the fact that the U.S. dollar is very overvalued. The U.S. has been deindustrialized and can't produce anything. The cost of living in the U.S. is so high. So people they're blown away in the U.S. that in China, you can go to the grocery store and buy fresh produce and get a big cart of food, and it costs like 100 yuan, which is like $13, whereas the same thing in the US would be over $100. So just because people make higher wages compared to China doesn't mean they actually live better. That's been very eye-opening. It's also been eye-opening for people learning about the health system in China, learning that you can go to a hospital and you can pay like what ends up often being like $3 to go see a doctor. And to get medicine, it's like $1 because they have all these generics that are produced by Chinese companies, and there are also state-owned companies as well. So, I mean, healthcare is almost free. It's extremely cheap. And that in the US, people are spending thousands of dollars to do an X-ray or a CAT scan. And so again, in the Western media, the narrative about China, and we've actually seen this kind of backlash in social media as well, being like the average person in China lives in horrific poverty and they don't have enough food. This is a vision that people have of China that, if it was ever accurate, and of course it's grossly exaggerated, they're thinking of China maybe 60 years ago. I mean, 800 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty. It's the most incredible campaign of poverty reduction in human history. China has carried out the most remarkable campaign of economic development in modern history. And now people are finally getting a glimpse of that, ironically, because the US government tried to ban an app that the US government couldn't control the algorithm of to prevent them from getting access to information. So now they have access to even more information. It's deeply ironical, deeply ironic.
I think that commentators have referred to it as the greatest Streisand effect in history. You know, Streisand effect meaning you're trying to hide something and essentially you send people to see it. And I think what has been striking for many Americans on Xiaohongshu for the first time is that they have really realized, and these are their words, you know, our government has spent decades lying to us.
What do you mean? That it never had to be this hard for us? Like, what do you mean in other countries they don't have to spend 20% of their paycheck on groceries? What do you mean in other countries everyone can own homes because they're not paying $2,000 a month in rent, or that their mortgages aren't like their entire paycheck? What do you mean that people in China work one job and they don't even work 40 hours and they can easily afford their life? And then I'm over here working 60 hours a week, just me as a single parent, to like barely make ends meet.
And so I see that this kind of complete breakthrough in class awareness or class consciousness, if you will, because of Xiaohongshu, not simply in terms of, you know, infrastructure and social services, medicine, but just the entire edifice of lies that they've been fed to seems to have broken down for your average American viewer.
What's also funny about this situation with Xiaohongshu is that this is not a political app. So, you know, there are some people now saying that the U.S. government is going to ban Xiaohongshu next, which could be a very real possibility. But Weibo is kind of the main political app, along with Bilibili. Weibo is like the Twitter of China. Bilibili is like the YouTube of China. And there are a lot of the people who do political videos and write about politics and such do it on those apps. Xiaohongshu is similar to Instagram, but a lot of people thought that it was basically the Chinese version of TikTok, although the Chinese version of TikTok is called Douyin, which is basically the exact same app. It's just the version only for mainland China. Although, actually, that has opened up another can of worms, and I think about it, because Douyin, the mainland Chinese version of TikTok, has now also changed its policy in response to this mass immigration to Xiaohongshu. Now, Douyin allows people with foreign cell phone numbers to create accounts. So actually, what we're seeing is pretty remarkable. I would say it's pretty historic, which is that some of these Chinese apps are kind of integrating their mainland Chinese app and the international app and kind of breaking down that barrier a little bit. And this wasn't planned in any way. So I think this could be a very historic moment. And the question I have now is, are people going to stay on Xiaohongshu using this app now that TikTok is available? Will TikTok be banned after 75 days? Because Trump, you know, he always says, I'm going to make a deal. He thinks he's a narcissist. He thinks he can just change everything. Yeah, I see a video here of someone saying, American friends, please stay here. I'm not so sure if they will stay there in the long term. But what's interesting is that, you know, Trump claims he can always make a deal. He says he's going to make a deal with, you know, Israel, Palestine. There's not going to be a deal because Israel doesn't want a deal. They want all of the land. They want to colonize everything. And similarly, he says, I'm going to make a deal. Well, he's not going to force ByteDance to sell TikTok. They've made that very clear. They're not going to give U.S. big tech monopolies in Silicon Valley control over this platform. the US represents about 5% of the world population. TikTok is massive in Latin America, in Africa, in many parts of Asia. So why would they ban their app? Why would they sell their app, because the US is threatening to ban it? You know where the largest audience is for TikTok? It's actually Indonesia. It's not even the United States. So, I mean, what we're seeing is, I think this is symptomatic of something much larger. And it is deeply important what's happening with Xiaohongshu, but I think it's part of this larger transition where some of these other Chinese apps are becoming more and more international. And they're really the only challenge to US corporate monopolies. Let's think about this for a second. I always emphasize this point because I've traveled to many different countries. I've had the privilege of being able to. And what I've realized over the years is that basically every other country except for China is digitally colonized by US big tech corporations. Every single country. So for instance, India, which has, a right-wing Hindu nationalist government, they banned Chinese apps, including TikTok. And what did they replace them with? Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, YouTube. All of the major social media apps in India, the most populous country, are US social media apps.
For example, I saw so many drug users and homeless people on the streets in San Francisco, so much crimes. Those things don't exist in China at all.
Right.
It was so scary for us as the Chinese tourists. Like, this is so scary. You go to the rich neighborhood, rich people have a super rich and nice life. Right. So how can one country be so divided? The rich people living a luxurious life, the poor people are being marginalized, died on the street, became homeless on the street, no one cares about them. So this inequality, this instability will be a time bomb in the society. If a government doesn't solve these issues, eventually it will cause some internal conflict. That's my 2 cents, because everything is because of economy. I've been to some least developed countries. I don't see that level of homeless people. I don't see that level of crimes like that I saw in America.
Well, I think the first time President Trump gets into a trade war with China, the minute we have a disagreement, when we exchange tariffs, they're going to realize the news feed will be all pro-China. There's no pro-Israel stories on there, almost nothing. There's no pro-Taiwan stories. Do we want the predominant news source in America with young people to be pro-China, gradually, subtly anti-American? That's the question you have to ask.